I have nowhere else to go. Lonely rancher gave the mail-order bride shelter for one night. Next morning she changed his life forever. Montana Territory, deep winter of 1887. Snow fell in thick, silent banks across the frozen plains. Elias Granger, 32, had spent the day repairing broken pipes in the bitter cold. Water had frozen and burst overnight again. He returned to his isolated log cabin as dusk deepened, wood smoke still drifting lazily from the chimney. He carried his heavy oil lamp inside, shook the snow from his coat, and froze at the threshold. Footprints, barely 3, marched toward his hearth, small and unsteady, and wobbled back again. He stiffened and lifted his rifle from the rack, but before he shouldered it, he noticed faint movements inside his simple kitchen. He stepped forward, set down his lamp, and called softly, "Hello? Who's there?" A voice, trembling and soft, answered from the dim stove light. "I'm sorry, I thought this place was abandoned. I have nowhere else to go." Elias's hand paused on the rifle. He wiped his brow and saw a young woman standing amid overturned chairs and scattered dishes, her dress hem caked with frozen mud and snow, her breath curled in the lamplight. Hair hung in damp strands around her face, icy clinging to pale cheeks. Her eyes flicked to the rifle in his hands and back to the door behind her. Annabeth Moore, 24, a mail-order bride traveling 30 miles to a town where no one came to meet her, had skirted along ridges in a drifting blizzard until she found the faint glow of Elias's cabin on the horizon. She knocked once, then pushed the unlocked door, perhaps hoping someone still lived here, or that ghosts welcomed strangers more kindly than the living. Elias stood silent for several heartbeats. The wind rattled the shutters, and he felt something shift inside him. He lowered the rifle slowly. Annabeth's shoulders sagged. He retrieved a heavy wool blanket from the cupboard, draped it over her trembling shoulders, then knelt to light the stove fire, the blaze hissing to life. He placed a kettle on the embers, began stirring wood in the hearth. She wrapped her arms around the blanket, nodded faintly. He said quietly, "You can stay through the night, just until the storm passes." She looked up, eyes wide, lips trembling. She nodded again, no words. He moved slowly, placed a small iron kettle of warm tea on the table, and gestured toward a stool. She sat without hesitation, hands pressed to the hot metal. Steam fogged the air gently. Elias removed his coat, draped it over a chair for her, then stepped into the corner to clear a stool. He scanned the shelves, simple jars of cornmeal, beans, salted pork, but nothing inviting. He ladled tea into a chipped enamel cup, pushed it toward her. She sipped, her fingers trembling against the cup, and looked at him through faded lashes. He studied her with quiet intensity. Her eyes were the color of winter smoke, haunted and wary, as if she had seen too few kind faces. He felt a strange longing, like a thread that anchored him to something he had not allowed himself to seek since his wife died 2 winters past. She sipped again, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone more rightful to appear. Elias cleared his throat softly. "I will start supper soon. If you want something warm to eat, you'll have to help. Can you manage?" She nodded silently. He hesitated slightly. "You can help, or you can sit and rest. Either is fine." She stood and moved with deliberate care, fetching a tin pan and chopping parsley from a jar beside the table. He watched the way her hands worked, steady, precise, exhausted, and recognized that telling her what to do would offer solace to her more than silence alone. The storm raged outside and night deepened. Elias lit a second lamp. He watched her stir mush and salted pork in the skillet. He placed the spoon near her hand, shared his portion. She offered him only a nod of thanks. But her eyes softened. The wind shook the cabin logs, and outside he heard snow slide from the roof in muffled thuds. He turned the kettle toward the fire to simmer and moved to fetch blankets. When he returned, he found her wrapped in his own wool coat, edging toward sleep on a low bench. He sat across the hearth, studiously ignoring the unbidden pinch in his chest, and watched the flames dance. She murmured, "Thank you. You did not send me away." Her voice was faint. He offered nothing more than a small head nod, but in that gesture he accepted something both fragile and precious. The clock on the mantel had stopped months ago, but time lived again in that flickering light. Elias looked once more at Annabeth's sleeping form, alone, weary, abandoned by a world she trusted, and felt a warmth rise in him that no winter could still. He laid a blanket over her and settled deeper into his chair, as if standing watch over something rare. Outside, the wind howled, but within the cabin the fire crackled, and two lives began a quiet, unexpected turning point. Snow fell through the morning like sifted flour. The logs of Elias's cabin creaked faintly as the wind swept over the roof. Inside, the fire still burned, casting soft orange shadows across the floorboards. Annabeth lay curled on a bench near the hearth, her face slack with exhaustion, one arm wrapped around herself like armor. Elias sat in his chair, awake. He had not slept. His eyes rested on her, watchful yet distant. He was not a man used to company, certainly not women who showed up out of the cold with nothing but bruised hands and eyes full of fear. But she had not tried to lie. She had not begged. She had simply asked and then fallen silent. At daybreak, Elias slipped outside, fed the horse, cracked the ice off the trough, and split enough wood to last the day. When he came back in, the kettle was already warm and 2 cups sat on the table. Annabeth stood over the wash basin, quietly scrubbing the tin plates from last night. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, her hair tied back with a scrap of ribbon she must have pulled from her bag. "I hope you do not mind," she said softly when she noticed him. "I thought it best to earn my keep." Elias shrugged, not unkindly. "I suppose if you broke something, it'd be your trouble to fix it." She smiled faintly and went back to rinsing. Then, without turning, she said, "You have mending needles?" He pointed toward a wooden box by the fireplace. She found it, threaded a needle, and sat by the window, patching one of his old flannel shirts, her fingers precise. Elias poured coffee into 2 cups and set one beside her. He sat across the room, nursing his own mug in silence before asking, "Who sent for you?" Annabeth's hand paused mid-stitch. Her throat worked once before she spoke. "I do not know. The letter came to my boarding house from the Denver agency. Said there was a man in Bitter Hollow needing a wife. I signed the agreement, boarded the coach, and when I stepped off, no one came. The station clerk pointed me toward the road and said if I hurried, I could catch someone headed north." She looked up, eyes apologetic. "I suppose I was not the one he wanted, after all." Elias frowned, staring into his cup. "You said you were a nurse." Annabeth nodded. "During the war, in Virginia. After that, there was little left. My father died of the fever 2 winters ago. My mother, she lost her will before the spring. The mail order agency was all that was left to try." Elias did not speak for a while. Snow brushed against the windows like whispered doubts. Outside, the path to town was vanishing beneath drifts. He rose, pulled his coat from the wall peg, and stepped to the door. When he opened it, the wind howled in. Annabeth winced. "You are going out?" He glanced over his shoulder. "I was going to take you to the church in town. Let Reverend Whitaker sort this out, but—" He gestured toward the snow, swallowing the fence posts. "We are not going anywhere today." Annabeth lowered her eyes. "I understand." That night, the storm deepened. Wind shrieked through the cracks in the logs, and Elias added wood to the fire until it glowed hot and steady. He opened a small tin box from the back cupboard. Inside it, a wrapped parcel of dried mushrooms. Morel, gathered from the northern ridges, something he had kept untouched for 3 years. He began chopping them into the pot on the fire. Annabeth looked up, surprised. "Those are rare." He nodded once. "I saved them, for the coldest day." Her brow furrowed. "Is today the coldest?" Elias stirred the soup slowly. "Maybe not, but it is the first day someone else has sat at this table since she died." Annabeth went still. He ladled the soup into 2 bowls, handed one to her. She took it with both hands, her eyes watching him carefully. "I will make sure you get to town," Elias said, "when the storm clears." Annabeth nodded. She tasted the soup and closed her eyes as warmth spread through her. Outside, the wind beat against the roof, but inside the cabin, something unfamiliar settled between them. Quiet understanding and the fragile start of trust. The storm did not break for 3 days. Snow piled like sand dunes along the porch, and the sky remained the color of cold ash. Inside the cabin, the air was a mix of pine smoke, steam, and the quiet rhythm of two people learning to share space without speaking too much. Elias kept to his routines. He split wood, boiled water, salted meat, and fed the mule when visibility allowed. But now there was a second cup at the table, a second pair of boots drying by the hearth, and a woman's hum, soft and tentative when she thought he was not listening. On the second evening, Elias noticed a raw patch of skin along his left hand. The cold had pinched deeper than he realized. The top layer of skin blistered red and pale. Annabeth knelt beside him without being asked, pulling a tin of balm from her traveling bag. "You should have said something," she murmured, smoothing the salve over the skin with careful fingers. "I've had worse," he muttered. "I know. I have too." She wrapped his hand in linen and tied it gently, then stood and moved back to her corner without another word. Later that night, Elias pushed her chair closer to the hearth when she was not looking. He poured the last of the brewed pine tea into her cup and left his own empty. Annabeth noticed, but did not say anything. She simply placed her cold hands around the cup and nodded once in thanks. That night, they both lingered near the fire longer than usual, neither willing to admit the silence between them had grown warmer. On the third day, after a lunch of root soup and hard biscuits, Annabeth looked toward the door and said softly, "I used to count days by letters." Elias turned toward her. "My fiancé and I, he wrote every day until Gettysburg." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded paper snowflake, yellowed at the edges. She unfolded it carefully, laying it on the table like something sacred. This was the last thing he sent. It came with a note, "I will make you 100 more when I return." He never did. Elias stared at the delicate cutouts, the crooked little stars and arrows sliced into the paper. "I was at Gettysburg," he said after a moment, his voice hoarse. "Second day. Left side. Lost 3 ribs and a piece of my hearing." Annabeth looked at him slowly. "You were there?" He nodded. "A lot of men left something behind at that place." He looked back at the snowflake. So did I. The fire crackled between them. Elias stood, walked over to the mantel. He opened a drawer beneath the shelf and pulled out a weathered photo. The edges curled, the glass cracked. It was of a woman with auburn hair and a soft, lopsided smile. "My wife," he said, placing it beside the snowflake, "died of scarlet fever. I buried her under that ridge behind the barn." Annabeth's eyes softened. She reached out and adjusted the snowflake slightly, so it sat just beside the photo, not covering it, not replacing it, only accompanying it. Elias looked at her, then at the table, and nodded. They did not speak of it again that night. But when the wind howled and the fire sputtered low, Elias rose and added 2 more logs, not for warmth, but because something in the silence needed protecting. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside, grief began to thaw, just a little. By the 5th morning, the sky broke wide open. The wind calmed, the sun cracked pale and thin above the white horizon, and the world looked scrubbed clean. Elias hitched the mule, wrapped Annabeth in a spare wool coat, and set off down the icy road toward the town of Galloway. It was 20 miles over hard snow and frozen ruts. They did not talk much, but Annabeth's gloved hand gripped the side rail of the sled, and her eyes stayed locked on the hills ahead. Elias kept his eyes forward too, jaw set tight. The town came into view just after midday. Chimneys smoked, boots crunched, and gossip traveled faster than snowmelt. They reached the church first. It was a squat white building with a bell tower and frost-crusted windows. Elias tied the mule and led Annabeth up the steps. Inside, the warmth hit first, then the silence. A few women sat knitting near the back pews. One looked up, narrowed her eyes. The pastor, a stout man in his 60s with a crooked collar, came down the aisle when Elias called his name. "We need to find a place for her," Elias said. "Mail order bride, abandoned up north. She's no trouble." The pastor squinted. "Name?" "Annabeth Moore," she said, softly. He pulled out a heavy book, flipped pages. "No record," he muttered. "No husband signed for her. No payment registered. She's not legally wed." "I never said I was," Annabeth said quietly. Someone behind them whispered, just loud enough, "She's one of the rejects, you can always tell." Another voice answered, sharper, came all the way just to get passed around. Annabeth's breath hitched. She turned, backing toward the door. Elias stood still. His jaw worked silently, but he said nothing. Not yet. Annabeth pushed open the church doors and stepped into the cold. The snow had started falling again, slow and hushed. She stood under the awning, arms wrapped around herself, trembling as much from shame as from cold. Elias followed. She did not look at him, just whispered, "I am not who you think I am." "I know exactly who you are," Elias said. "You came out of the snow and into my kitchen. You sewed my sleeve, you boiled my tea, you cleaned the ash from my stove. And you never asked for anything but space to breathe." She blinked, her eyes glistening. "I brought you here," he said, his voice low and even, "to be claimed. I did not know it would be by me." She looked up at him then, really looked. The wind curled around them, sharp and sweet with pine. "I am not clean," she whispered, "not untouched." "I am not whole," he replied, "not unchanged." The snow caught in her lashes. She started to say something, but Elias stepped forward, removed his glove, and gently placed his hand on her shoulder, not forcefully, just enough for her to feel the truth in it. "Do you want to come back with me?" he asked. Annabeth swallowed hard. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she said. "You do now," Elias said. They turned together, walking down the steps toward the mule and sled. Behind them the church bell tolled, not for a wedding, not for a funeral, but maybe, just maybe, for the start of something not yet named. Snow still blanketed the world when Elias and Annabeth returned to the Granger ranch, but inside the cabin dawn felt warmer than any storm could be. Elias stoked the ashes of the old iron wood stove until embers glowed orange. He adjusted the chimney so smoke cleared easily, then began arranging split logs in the rack. Annabeth watched from the doorway, wrapped in her wool coat, breath misting in the soft light. She did not speak, just nodded when he pointed toward a wooden chair. Elias carried in furniture, a wooden table he had carved years ago, and a spare bedroll from the loft. He cleared a corner near the stove and placed a small trunk beside it. Annabeth helped by sweeping the floor with a hand broom and stacking blankets neatly. Her quiet presence filled the room more than any words could. He went outside to fetch water and ice from the trough. She pulled a rag bag from her travel satchel and began sewing a torn sleeve. She did not ask, but Elias noticed. Later he found a tin of dried cornmeal and gave it to her. She smiled, measuring out enough with a wooden spoon. When the stove was hot again, Elias gathered yellow cornmeal, a handful of sugar, a bit of lard, and a pinch of salt. Annabeth joined him near the hearth, pulling out the skillet and wooden spoon, hand steady. She stirred the batter slowly, humming softly under her breath. Elias watched her carefully, then set a skillet of fat and hot griddle near the flames. She ladled batter onto it. The first cake hissed and browned. She flipped it gently and offered the steaming cornbread to him, torn in half without hesitation. He bit into it slowly. The crust was crisp, the middle soft and warm. He nodded, pleased. "I learned to bake when I was little," she said quietly. "My mother made cornbread every Sunday. I loved making sugar, and of course I made pies." He smiled faintly. "I haven't tasted any since my wife before." Annabeth shook her head softly. "It's a simple thing, but it's something." They did not talk much after that, only routine noises, the crackle of fire, the whisk of broom, the soft scraping of wood as Elias split logs outside. She showed him how to wet a cloth before sweeping to catch dust. He showed her how to cleave a dry log so that it split along the grain. Their hands brushed lightly as they worked, just enough to acknowledge trust. Mid-afternoon, a small knock sounded at the door. Elias opened it to reveal Clara, the orphan girl from town, no more than 7, eyes damp from tears, shoulders shaking against a tattered shawl. She stood there clutching a tin bucket that had once held salt. "Mr. Granger," she said shyly, voice small, "I have nowhere to go. Might I have some wood, please?" Annabeth reached out instantly, stepping forward with a skillet of cornbread in hand. She knelt and offered the child a piece, crumbly and warm. Clara took it, cheeks pink with surprise. Annabeth stood and motioned. Clara ducked inside, setting her bucket on the floor. Elias, stepping aside, fetched a small bundle of kindling and a few split logs from the rack. Clara's eyes widened. He simply said, "Take this tonight, and if you're hungry, more cornbread will be ready in the morning." He poked his head into the basket, and its contents went straight up. Clara bowed in a manner too polite for her age. She put the wood into her bucket and scurried out, cornbread in hand. Annabeth closed the door and leaned against it, breath catching. "I should have told you not to open the door," she murmured. Elias reached out, brushed a crumb from her sleeve, and placed the empty cornbread skillet on the table. "I don't want you to handle hunger alone," he said softly. The sky outside softened into evening. Snow flurries drifted, but inside the cabin something settled that had not been there before. A sense of home becoming possible. That night, after tucking Annabeth into the bedroll near the stove, Elias came to her corner with a small wooden board. By its dark grain he burned words with a heated poker. "This cabin is no longer a place of silence." He leaned over the hearth and placed the board gently against the wall. Annabeth stirred but did not wake. Elias stood back and examined his work by candlelight. The letters glowed warm, bold, but simple. Beneath them, a tiny sprig of lavender, tied with string, lay pressed. He said softly, to no one but the room, "It's time for warmth again." Outside, the wind sighed through the eaves. Inside, the hearth crackled. And in that moment, a cabin once isolated by snow and sorrow became a place where quiet gestures spoke louder than words, and where a single decision shaped the turning of 2 lives forever. Morning came crisp and sharp. The sky stretched clean and blue, the snow outside crusted under the light of the rising sun. Annabeth stood on the porch, her sleeves rolled up, pinning laundry along a line stretched between 2 cedar posts. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her hands red from washing. Behind her, inside the cabin, Elias was sanding a length of pine near the fireplace, his hands sticky with resin. He whistled low under his breath, a habit long since forgotten and newly returned. Then came the sound of hooves crunching the frost, slow and deliberate. Annabeth looked up. A large black wagon rolled into the clearing, the kind used to haul supplies or cattle, or sometimes worse. It stopped with a jolt. The door creaked open. Out stepped a man in a long tan coat and a hat too clean for a place like this. Roy Mercer, 45, tall, slick, with silver buckles on his boots and a ledger always tucked under his arm. Annabeth's breath caught, her arms lowered, her face drained of color. "Roy," she whispered, almost inaudible. He grinned as he approached, hands in pockets. "Well, I'll be damned. You made yourself cozy." Without knocking, Roy pushed through the cabin door, his boots thudding across the wooden floor. Annabeth followed slowly, frozen. Elias turned at the sound, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes narrowed. Roy held up a folded piece of paper. "She's mine. Mail order contract, signed and paid. Deposits right here in ink. Which means what you've got here is property, cowboy." Annabeth stepped back, trembling. Elias stood still, letting the words settle. Then he walked forward slowly, placing himself between them. Roy smirked. "You hiding my goods, cowboy?" Elias said nothing. Roy pushed him. Elias staggered, caught his footing, and without a word, swung. His fist met Roy's jaw with a dull crack. Roy stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the table. A thin trickle of blood ran from his nose. Outside, A few neighbors, drawn by the wagon and voices, stopped near the gate. They watched silently. Roy straightened up, waving the paper in the air. "You all see this?" he shouted. "This woman was bought fair and legal. I came to collect what's mine." The crowd murmured. Elias wiped his knuckles on his coat. He looked around, then turned into the cabin. Annabeth stood still, near the stove, eyes brimming with tears. A minute later, Elias emerged. In his hand was a leather pouch, weathered, thick, the one he had buried under the loose floorboard, filled with silver coins and paper bills saved over 3 years. He placed it in Roy's hand. "There. That's what you paid, plus more. Now, she owes you nothing, and I owe her everything." Roy glanced inside the pouch. It was more than fair. It was more than the value of any paper contract. He opened his mouth to protest, but Elias stepped closer, his voice like ice. "Leave, and next time you put a price on a woman's life, make sure you can afford the man who loves her." Roy blinked. The crowd didn't cheer, didn't clap, but no one moved to stop Elias. No one stepped to Roy's side. Elias turned, took Annabeth's hand, held it up for all to see. "You called her mail order. I call her a miracle. She is not what I bought, she is what I waited for." Roy backed toward his wagon, wiping his nose with a silk handkerchief. He climbed aboard and said nothing as he turned the reins. The wagon groaned away, swallowed by the trees. Silence fell. Then from the crowd, an old woman stepped forward. Her back was bent, her scarf tattered. She handed Annabeth a piece of hard bread wrapped in linen. Her eyes met Elias's. "Looks like someone finally bought back his soul, too." And with that she walked away, her boots crunching softly on the frost. Elias did not let go of Annabeth's hand. Inside, the fire burned steady, and though no vows had yet been spoken, something permanent had taken root. Not in law, not in paper, but in action. And in love. Spring arrived gently in Montana, not with trumpets, but with softened soil, blooming grass, and wind that carried the scent of life returning. On a hill overlooking the wide valley, a small group gathered in silence. No ribbons fluttered, no polished boots or wedding bands glinted in the sun. There was only earth, sky, and the hush of those who had come not out of obligation, but witness. This was the hill where Elias Granger had buried his father years before. He had come here often to speak into the wind, to remember strength, to ask questions no one else could hear. Today, he came not alone. Annabeth stood beside him, barefoot in the damp grass, wearing a simple white dress sewn by the old widow who had once handed her bread. The sleeves were slightly uneven, the hem stitched in mismatched thread, but the way it clung to the wind made her look like a painting that had once been folded away, now finely framed. Her hair fell loose over her shoulders. In her hands she held a single sprig of clover. Elias wore his oldest shirt, clean but faded at the seams. In the breast pocket, a sprig of dried lavender peeked out, his mother's favorite flower. His boots were scuffed, his hands stained from wood and work, but his eyes were steady. The town's old preacher, who had once scoffed at mail-order brides and called them paper promises, now stood with his Bible open and voice softened by time. "I have read many vows in my life," he said, "but today I will say none, because this is not tradition, this is something older." Elias turned to Annabeth. From his pocket he pulled a long, braided cord made of dried meadow grass. It was rough, uneven, but strong. He held it out, hands trembling slightly. "Not a vow for show," he said. "A promise, in dust, in years, in the storm that brought you to me. I'm yours, Annabeth, in full." Annabeth's lips quivered. Her voice came soft but clear. "And I've always been mine, until now. Because now, I'm yours too." He tied the grass cord gently around both their wrists. It held. The wind lifted just then, as if exhaling, and from a fence post nearby, a small brown sparrow landed. Clara, standing beside the widow, clapped her hands. "They got wings now," she shouted. Laughter broke the stillness. Not loud, not mocking, but the kind that comes when a heart unclenches, when healing is no longer a hope, but a fact. After the ceremony, guests quietly began their descent. Some left small tokens, bundles of dried herbs, cloth dolls, a jar of preserves, on a wooden bench near the hilltop. Elias turned to Annabeth. "There's something I want to show you." They walked hand in hand to the great oak tree where his father's cross still stood, weathered and worn but unmoved. Beneath it, Elias knelt and opened a box carved from pine, the hinges rusted but intact. Inside was a single photo. His mother, young and smiling, holding a tin cup and a newborn lamb. Elias placed it gently beside another photo, one recently taken, one he had asked a traveling photographer to capture without Annabeth knowing, her sitting on the porch with Clara in her lap, both of them laughing. He stood and looked at the two images side by side. "Now they're both here," he said. "Two women who gave me life." Annabeth stepped behind him, wrapped her arms around his waist, and rested her cheek against his back. "And two souls who found each other," she whispered. "Not through letters, but through loss." Elias turned and kissed her brow. That night there was no feast, no dancing, but there was warmth. The cabin glowed with soft candlelight. Clara played on the floor with a straw doll. Annabeth baked cornbread that filled the home with a scent so rich even silence felt full. Elias sat in his chair, the same one he had carved alone long ago. Now it creaked with the weight of two hands resting on his shoulders. And though he said nothing, his heart spoke loudly. The ranch no longer echoed with quiet. It sang with the sound of wooden wheels, morning laughter, and the clink of tin cups. Chickens clucked, water boiled, the wind tapped gently at the shutters. But more than any sound, more than any sign, the eyes of a man once broken by grief now held something brighter than pain, deeper than hope. Love, not just found, but stayed. If this story stirred your heart, the quiet courage of Elias, the resilience of Annabeth, and the way love bloomed not from perfection but from pain, then there are more stories waiting for you on the frontier. At Wild West Love Stories, we tell tales of love that defy distance, dust, and despair, of women who endure, of men who remember, of hearts that find their way home, even across silence and snow. So if you believe in second chances, in vows made not with gold but with grit, in the kind of love that leaves a light on in the dark, subscribe now to Wild West Love Stories. Because somewhere, out there in the wind, another heart is waiting to be found.